We have a very intriguing title this evening, and I trust that either the title or the speaker has brought you out, or hopefully some other good intent. Eastern Orthodox Ecclesiology in the Golden Age of Christian Unity. As I was saying in the chapel, if you were wondering if there's ever been such a golden age, or if you think it's now, or if you think it's yet to come, I trust that you will go away with some answers this evening. I confess that I do not know Dr. Opperwall as well as I would like. Our paths do not cross often enough. He teaches patristics and church history at the Orthodox School of Theology at Trinity College, colleague of Father Jeffrey, and is also an online learning consultant at the University of Waterloo. We may need to pick your brain about how best to develop our online learning here. I also know he's a very well-read and scholar, and has had quite an interesting spiritual theological peregrination in his life thus far. And so without further ado, and I invite you to consult actually his personal website if you'd like to see his publications and other activities. We have a number of these posters left, so you can take them home with you as a keepsake of this moment of Christian unity. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Daniel Opperwall.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate it, and thanks so much for the invite from the Sheptytsky Institute. This is such a wonderful lecture series, and it really is an honor to be on the list with some wonderful names over the years already, and many more to come. Really. So yeah, my title is deliberately a little provocative, maybe a little confusing, and it comes from two intuitions that I have, and I want to talk about them both this evening and examine a little bit how they intersect. One of my intuitions, and you can try it on for size after I present it to you, see if you think I'm right. One of my intuitions is that we are living right now in the golden age of Christian unity. Christians, in my view, have never in history been more closely knit together. Never have relations between different Christian groups been better than they are today. That's one of my intuitions. I realize, however, that my second intuition, which follows close on its heels, especially as an Orthodox, may seem to fly strongly in the face of that. If you look at the Orthodox Church today, we see Moscow and Constantinople breaking down, a little bit less publicized, similar situation with Jerusalem and Antioch. And so one might look at that and say, the Orthodox Church is falling apart. There's tensions in the Catholic Church, this and that. How on earth is the golden age of Christian unity? So I want to focus on the Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology piece of this and try to demystify some of the things that I think are going on in the Orthodox Church, and link that up to our current era, which I think is one of actually tremendous goodwill. And I think in some ways it's that goodwill itself that contributes to the way the Orthodox Church is taking shape in the modern period. So let me walk you through some of those intuitions. The story I want to tell you about Orthodox ecclesiology and a little bit about this golden age of Christian unity. I want to explore over time the tension that exists for all Christians between two essential sort of ideas or essential values within Christian community building and the making of Christian churches. One is the church's particular form. That's our local communities, real, tangible, on-the-ground Christian communities. And the other is this sense that Christians seem to have had from the very beginning, that the church has a universal dimension that ought to unify Christians, and that transcends any given specific local community. I want to explore the interplay of these two dynamics across time to get us to some insight, I hope, at the end about Orthodox ecclesiology in this golden age. So let's start by talking about unity. Let's start with this lovely chart, this lovely branch. It's already causing chuckles. Just here. That's the response I want, really. We have one of these lovely branch models here, purporting to tell us about how the various Christian groups that we have today have come about, when and where. And we've all seen a version of this chart, no doubt at all. And there are thousands and thousands of different versions that often pick different winners, who's the real church still today, and who are all the schismatics. These charts make all sorts of different decisions about who to include. This one's not too bad. We actually, the Church of the East gets a little A little acknowledgement here for still existing, good for them. The Oriental Orthodox too. Sometimes you'll see these charts go all the way to the 16th century. Everything is just one until the Protestants come along. The Orthodox are here. That's good. And this chart also is nice because Eastern Catholicism is acknowledged here, which you often don't see. So I think that's appropriate for this room. You all are real according to the chart. Thank you. And I'll comment a little because that actually is kind of interesting to me. I'll comment a little bit on that in a moment. But so this isn't the worst of these charts that I've ever seen by any stretch, but it suffers from all of the same problems that any one of these charts, any one of these branch charts, always suffer from. These types of charts sort of purport to us rhetorically. They want to say to us that they are kind of distillation, a simplification of the basic history of Christian groups, and I would propose that simplifying things in the study of history is just fine, and sometimes we need these charts to kind of cut through some of the fat and get us down to the big hits or something like that. But a chart like this, I would propose rhetorically, isn't just simplifying. It is lying. It is absolutely lying to us on a variety of different fronts, and it's really, really a big problem for how we conceive of what Christian unity and that universal dimension of the church looks like now and in the past. So I want to point out three really important problems with a chart like this and virtually any version thereof. One, we have thousands and thousands of missing groups. Not just all of the thousands of Protestant denominations that really ought to be on there, but all kinds of groups throughout history, going back to early days, that simply aren't acknowledged here, that don't appear anywhere. Where are the Maronites on this chart? Very interesting history. Departure from other groups during the Monothelite controversy, reunion with the Catholic Church in the modern period. Where are the Hussites, for example? Where are a little group like today's Sedevacantists on the Catholic side? Where are the Old Believers? Where are the Old Calendarists? I was going to say where are the Anabaptists, but this chart actually gets them, so good for this chart. Where are the Anabaptists? But just to name a few that jump to mind. That's problem number one. Thousands of missing groups. But that's the littlest of the three problems in my mind. Problem number two, very, very big, is this part of the chart, this tail end, the gray line where we all are supposedly united somewhere in the past. Virtually all of these charts have some sort of union line at the start. And this is simply not true. Never has there been one gray unified line in the church's past. And I mean never. I don't mean for a very brief period of time. I don't mean just for a few minutes. I mean never. The church is literally born in schism. And this is not a revisionist claim. This is what the New Testament tells us, right on the page. The first order of business for these guys, the first order of business is what? The first order of business in the church's history is to replace Judas. The first thing we do is deal with a breakdown in that universal dimension in church unity. Literally. The first thing. And if you want to set Judas aside, perhaps a little bit more on point, is the fact that for every mainstream Christian living today, this line starts with at least two starting points. At least two, according to the New Testament. It's the church in Jerusalem, following James, Peter, and the other apostles who knew Jesus, and this guy Paul. He has this vision. He starts off kind of independently over that. This is just what it says in the New Testament. And it's only later on that he comes to Jerusalem, and they kind of work things out, and those two lines merge. Now, modern scholars would also say maybe the Johannine communities are a third starting point that emerges. And that's, a little bit more maybe controversial. It's harder to say how the Johannine communities mix with the Jerusalem communities. But certainly from the New Testament, we know at least two starting points, no matter how conservative you are, that come together. So that's an enormous problem. This line was never there. And of course, if we go back to those early days, there are also all kinds of Gnostic groups. Christian theologies, Christian groups that didn't get sort of unified into that mainstream. What's really unusual about Paul isn't so much that somebody starts off outside that Jerusalem church saying he's having a vision. What's unusual about Paul is he actually manages to get the act together with the Jerusalem church and unify with them. That's what's odd about Paul. There are all kinds of people running around with different messages about Jesus from the start. So to draw this correctly, we have to have who knows how many, hundreds, maybe even thousands of lines here from the very start. Certainly that Pauline line and that Jerusalem line from the very, very beginning. That's number two. That's a really big problem. But number 3, and believe it or not, I think this is the biggest problem of all in the rhetoric of this chart. These lines are straight in this chart. It's a disaster. We're saying, okay, the Assyrian church breaks off the Council of Ephesus 431, goes down, and just we have a continuous schism. Orient, Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, etc., etc. And as I said before, this part's a little better than some, because at least we see one spot where we admit, oh, there's a reconvergence here with the creation of the Eastern Catholic Church. One spot. But if you wanted to draw this chart correctly, all these lines would be wobbling all over the place. They'd be converging and diverging, being close at certain points in time, being farther away at other points in time. All of these lines would have to reunite at certain points. The Orthodox and Catholic churches, who don't split in the 11th century, by the way, split in the 13th century, but that's an aside point. Even from the point that you really can split these two up, there's at least 2 moments of re-entry of communion between these groups. It doesn't last very long. Florence and Lyon didn't endure, obviously. But where are these convergences, where these lines reconnected a couple of times? That's also true for the Oriental Orthodox and the Assyrian Orthodox with the Orthodox Catholic Church. Reunited several times through the various points in history. Again, didn't endure. Where's all that? And then, of course, there's those periods of time where goodwill is higher. Things are kind of coming together. Maybe they don't quite reunite. But Christians converge at various points in time. Where is all that in this chart? We get this picture that we have once a schism, always a schism, and people go on in a big straight line. Now, it's not just my lack of visual art skills that makes it impossible for me to draw a real chart. That would look a lot more like the reality of Christian history. I actually tried to draw one through the first 2 centuries once, and it took me many hours, it was incomplete, and it was complete chaos everywhere, just trying to account for everything. But I want you to imagine this chart with all kinds of bending, all kinds of coming together, all kinds of convergences and divergences. I want you to imagine this chart with little blips coming off the lines, where people split off and then actually work it out and reunite. We see that in the Ethiopian church recently. We see that in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Imagine this chart as a mobile, dynamic, moving thing. And what I would propose to you is if you look very carefully through history, you'd see that all these lines together here, this chart wants us to believe are frayed, are all spread out, and only get worse, that they've actually gotten closer together than at any other point in time. Really. Even maybe the very, very beginning, even the apostolic period, per capita. It's at least a plausible hypothesis, which is something we don't think about a lot, I think, as Christians. So, that's my criticism of this chart, and a little case that we are a lot closer today than we might seem. Now, there was hilarious laughter when I showed this chart, and that's appropriate. And just about any good scholar will look at a chart like this and say, oh, what a nightmare. But it's amazing to me how often this is really deep in our heads when we think about the universal dimensions of the church. This is encoded. Even for those of us who know better, we think the universal church, that overarching thing that brings us together, this is something that's back there, and we've lost it, and it's gone. And what I would propose is that instead, what's really happened to Christians over many centuries is that they have had different ways of trying to make manifest the universal dimensions that they're trying to live out over the years. Oh no, looks like I might be missing a page. Oh, 2-sided, that's what I'm myself. There have been different ways that Christian groups have come together and tried to manifest, tried to live out, tried to embody these universal aspirations over time. And if we start to trace the ways we've tried to manifest that unity, we get a lot more clarity on what's going on within Christian groups and between them. So I want to walk through a few key phases in the way that different churches have tried to express their universality. We'll start at the beginning, earliest Christians. The apostolic period and the period immediately after the death of the apostles is almost universally idealized by Christians. There's really good reasons for that. This is our founding story, our origin story. During this period of time, we have a very intense emphasis on local communities. The particular is really important. You can see a little map here from an old textbook showing you some of the communities that start here in the during the first century across the Roman Empire. Just little dots, sort of spreading around a little bit in Rome, but mostly out of the east and in Anatolia. And these different dots, these different particular communities, are kind of aware of each other. They're interconnected, but they're mostly autonomous. They mostly do their own thing. And the level at which they seek a universal connection is really in two places. One is connection to various apostles. So the apostles that found these churches kind of pull them together into something that's greater than each individual community. But much more important in my mind, and very, very neglected, these churches, these very, very early churches, located their universal aspirations very much in eschatology, I think. We often forget that for these people, these first century Christians, okay, if you look at the New Testament, they believe that Jesus is coming back now, in their lifetime. Most of them, or at least a good number of them, would still be alive when he comes back. And the church's universal dimension, in that kind of a framework, in that kind of a world, is we are united by the fact that we're the ones he's going to pick when he gets back, which is going to be soon, now. And you start to have a crisis in the early church when more and more people start to die. You start to see it in the New Testament text, where even Paul is kind of, you can almost feel it in the text, like, oh man, this isn't happening as quick as we thought. Apostles start to die. This is a really big trouble. And by the time you get to the end of that apostolic phase, the end of that very first generation, and nobody or almost nobody is left who was alive during the time of Jesus, this is a crisis of ecclesiology for the early church. It absolutely is. And there are two basic responses to this crisis, which I will get to in just a moment. Before that, I want to say that each of these models of universality and particularity that I want to focus on this evening has a certain kind of appeal, has a certain benefit that we can see even from the modern point of view, and they all have problems involved, even this earliest phase. So this early approach offers, like I said, a huge amount of local autonomy, a lot of diversity, but a lot of key problems arise as well. One is that local communities have trouble getting along even with each other. Just read Paul's letters. This is what most of them are about. Local communities can't get their act together. But the second is that these churches were wrong. Like I said, Jesus doesn't come back when they thought. And now they have to face a crisis. I don't know what that is. So there's two basic responses to this crisis, to the death of the apostles. One is, before I get to Ignatius, one is a kind of prophetic response. You start to see groups, Montanists are especially notable here, that come along and say, we've gotten a new revelation, we've gotten a new message, the Holy Spirit spoke to us, come follow us. We'll be that unity point. We represent the universal church, right? New prophecy. So some people do follow these groups. But the second solution that sort of arises is what I'm going to call the Ignatian solution. Keep an eye on this one, because I'm going to start talking about a neo-Ignatian solution a little bit later. The second response is to start really emphasizing the importance of bishops in local communities. So instead of following everybody who comes along and says, oh, I've had a new vision, we start to focus on apostolic succession in its early forms, and people who are appointed to lead communities, who've had hands laid on them, that had hands laid on by the apostles, etc. And it's going to be the Ignatian model, of course, that will sort of take over the mainstream church and becomes the root of pretty much all Christians today. The Ignatian model, similar to that very, very first apostolic type model, really emphasizes local communities. Ignatius is very concerned about bishops keeping together their local flock, resolving problems there, creating unity on the ground in the particular community. But what's interesting about Ignatius is there's not a lot of account taken for what holds bishops together. So they hold their communities together. What holds them together into something universal? And lest I come off as flippant beneath an icon of this wonderful saint, Ignatius is almost kind of naive about this problem, I think, if you look at the studies. It almost seems like the assumption is if you have good bishops in every community, well, of course, they'll get along. Which may be, from an ideal Christian point of view, ought to be true. I don't think that good Christian people would get along with each other. But his focus is on the local, how we resolve problems between those communities. Almost just takes for granted that goodwill will prevail and we will have our universal dimension without even really trying. So this is another ideal that has big advantages, that local autonomy. But this almost naivete about the universality is a problem. And that problem starts to make itself known, and what we start to see, even just before the imperial period, is an increase in hierarchy. We start to get bishops above bishops, bishops who are a kind of court of appeal maybe at first, and who start to have official authority over other bishops to try to hold together these disparate local communities into something bigger than themselves. That is on the go when we enter the next big phase, phase 3 of Christian ecclesiology, in my read, and this is the imperial period. During the imperial period, of course, under theosis, there he is, Christianity will become the official state religion of the most powerful political force in the world at the time. The official state religion. We start to get a tremendous melding and unifying between the empire and this church, this Christian church, building off that hierarchical structure. The church becomes even more layered, even more hierarchical, starts emphasizing governance between bishops and between communities. And to a very large extent, and very quickly, really, the church becomes the empire, and the empire becomes the church to a very large extent. In a lot of ways, and I hope this isn't overly controversial or outrageous, but in a lot of ways, the emperor becomes the head of the church, really. It's hard to get around that. Bishops maintain a kind of autonomy that's customary to most Roman officials, neither more nor less. They're layered into these smaller regions, thank you, Brian, down to specific local communities. They often meet in councils to kind of advise the emperors what it really comes down to when they're having problems between themselves. And it's typically the emperor who will lay down the law and enforce one decision or another based on these councils. And if you don't think that the emperor can force his will onto bishops, including the Bishop of Rome, you can ask Pope Vigiliate. This is really how it works. Now, he's not always successful. Of course, we have schisms, people resisting the imperial church during this period of time. But this is the kind of structure that we see during the imperial period. In this model, the church has really begun to express its universality through its empire. Just as the empire has been set to govern the entire world, and this is really what Romans thought, they're destined to govern the whole world, so Christianity will be, and already is in a way, the religion of the whole world. We're united. Just as the empire is a conglomeration of specific communities that's destined to unite them all through this governance structure, so the church unites specific communities through a governance structure in this imperial period. Now, the imperial Christianity gets a really bad rap, and you might feel, possibly, I almost feel as I'm saying this, like I'm criticizing these people just by saying what I'm saying. I'm not meaning to do that. I'm just trying to observe how this really works. And I really want to emphasize here, just like all these other systems, this imperial way of looking at the church has big advantages, really big appeal. It's not just evil and awful. Like every formulation, it has positives. Here, universality has a name, it has a face, it has a political structure we can point to and say, that's what brings us together as Christians, beyond the particular. That's what unites us. Romans were really quite good at tolerating, by and large, quite good at tolerating a lot of diversity whenever they could. Religious diversity, philosophical diversity, whatever it was. Whenever they felt they could do to tolerate it, they would try. That's not all bad. And the church often followed suit in that. At its best, imperial Christianity gives you a really nice balance between this overarching structure and communal autonomy. But like all these systems, it has essential problems. And they probably jump right to mind for you. Corruption, violence, dissident Christians being sometimes executed or otherwise facing pressure from imperial authorities. And those are serious problems for this imperialist ecclesiology. But it's not all that. But maybe from the kind of historical point of view, from the point of view of the way I want to look at this evening, the biggest problem with imperial Christianity is kind of similar to that early phase of Christianity, which is that the empire doesn't last. It doesn't take over the whole world. It doesn't become the thing that unites everyone forever. It will start to fade over time. And so Christians, having hung their hat of unity on this empire, will now have to pivot again. We're going to get a fourth key phase, fourth key pivot, where we look for our unity. Now, this imperial collapse doesn't happen all at once. Obviously, the empire will recede over time. That's very, very important for when we get to the Orthodox modern responses momentarily. It will happen slowly over time. It's going to be first down here in Egypt and the Middle East. Empire will lose these territories by the late 6th century. And these communities, which are now the Oriental Orthodox Church, are already in schism with the mainstream imperial church, and that's kind of codified and sealed up when the empire loses that territory once and for all. These churches will kind of respond to the loss of the empire, well, first off, often with joy. They're already at odds with the imperial church. And so at first it's sort of like, wow, maybe this is better. That quickly fades, by the way, because the conquerors could be even harsher. Anyway, structurally what they do is they kind of become very monarchical within themselves and really quite isolated from one another. So you have the church around Alexandria, you have the church around Antioch, etc., up in Armenia and so forth. These become very monarchical, independent churches. And so their unity is seen in that one head bishop. So you have the Pope of Alexandria and so forth, who's the head of this one community. But there's actually not a lot of attention in these communities, and this is true to this present day. There's not a lot of attention in these communities to the overarching, the kind of global, we might say, universality. They become much more focused on themselves. Survival becomes really key for these communities. And so you get what are today very, very ethnic churches, by and large, displaying not a lot of evangelical impulse. And although they're in communion with each other, in general, the Oriental Orthodox don't have a kind of big structure above themselves. So it becomes local and monarchical. Now, Western Europe will start to face the loss of the empire a little bit later on. Now, it's not right away. If you read your Gibbon, it's not the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. The Roman Empire would control Italy and Western Europe pretty solidly through the 6th century, and starts to really lose that control in the late 6th and early 7th century. But the Roman Empire remains a force psychologically, especially, all the way until the very beginning of the 9th century in Western Europe. We would not call the Byzantines will still control Ravenna, will still control Rome all the way to that period of time, these little pockets. And as long as the empire is there psychologically, in principle, it still can play that role of creating unity. But it's in the early 9th century that it's gone for good in Western Europe. It's gone for good around Rome. And we'll get the Frankish Empire and a bunch of smaller principalities duking it out with each other, sloshing back and forth, and it gets very complicated over there in Western Europe. By the early 9th century. And so what do we get as a solution in the Western Church? We get papacy. This is by no means a crazy solution. It makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. Western Europe faces this loss of empire and makes a similar kind of monarchical shift to some of these Oriental Orthodox churches, but with a bit more of a universal flavor. So we have this Pope in Rome who is kind of the patriarch of the world. This is still very much the Catholic thinking today. Quite explicitly. This is a way of dealing with how do we manifest our universality? How do we embody our universality if we don't have this empire anymore? How do we have a phase 4? So this system is natural in a lot of ways, almost obvious, really quite effective as an adaptation in many respects. Put one bishop above all the other bishops. He becomes that embodiment. I'm going to get to the Orthodox next, basically, but first just ought to at least mention that we move forward into, say, the Protestant Reformation and so forth, start to get other ideas that I'm a little less qualified to speak about. We get things like the invisible church, this is a going thing among today, sort of to say everyone who believes is kind of united spiritually anyway. There's a lot less emphasis on any political unifying structure necessarily. So we get other solutions in the Protestant world over time. The one I want to look at, and the one we came here to hear me talk about, is the Orthodox solution to the loss of empire. Eastern Orthodox phase 4. One thing that almost never gets noticed in my reading about Orthodox ecclesiology, especially the way Orthodox write about their own ecclesiology, is that the Orthodox Church, maybe the thing that makes us most unique in a lot of ways, is that this imperial solution keeps working for way longer. Another 1,000 years, I would propose, in the East. You can still have the imperial solution, conceptually, to Christian unity. For one thing, the Roman Empire itself will survive in the East all the way to the 15th century. And once again, even here in 1450, the purple dots, that's what's left of the Byzantine Empire, almost nothing. But so long as there's something, that concept is still there. You can still hang your hat on it. But what often doesn't get noticed, and what's really remarkable, is how quickly and how easily these Christians, the Orthodox Christians at this time, were able to transfer this concept of the empire as unifying force to certainly the Russians, very much so, but also the Ottomans, believe it or not, especially in these early days. The Ottoman Sultan is kind of accepted as the emperor. And he's not a Christian emperor, which is very problematic. But we quickly get this millet system in and around Constantinople that actually elevates the power of the patriarchate, puts him in charge of secular affairs among Orthodox Christians in his empire. And we get a lot of political synergy between even the Ottoman Empire and the Orthodox Church to create that unity, that structure of the particular. In the world of Russia, the political rhetoric is very explicit. We are now the third Rome. We've inherited that duty, that job to unify the Christians under our control, and maybe around the world in this period of time. So when it finally does fall, a lot of transference to the Ottomans, a lot of transference to the Russians, and so there's still really an empire to kind of attach to all the way into the 19th century and in fact into the 20th century. Now, these empires too, in different ways, Russia and the Ottoman Empire obviously have very different histories, but in different ways will finally start to collapse in the 19th and into the early 20th century. We start to get a map that looks more and more like this. This is the Ottomans falling apart. And what we start to get bubbling up in place of these empires is will set the groundwork for Orthodox phase 4 ecclesiology. It's really interesting. What will happen is in the wake of the loss of the Ottoman Empire is we're going to get a new political technology on the world stage. It's never existed before, and that is the nation state. Previous to this period of time, what we think of as countries, nation states, obvious structure, this doesn't exist before really the 19th century. Where, especially in the Balkans, specific ethnic groups have a specific country where they self-govern. And quite quickly, those new nation states are going to start to say, well, we have a nation for our people, we're going to have a church for our people. This becomes a claim right away, as the Ottomans are receding. So the Orthodox grab this old concept called autocephaly, the self-headedness of various bishops, that goes way back into the imperial period to kind of indicate bishops who have nobody else, no other bishop above them. And they kind of graph that, kind of shift that onto countries, nation states. We're going to have autocephalous churches for each of these countries. This grafting, this shift, is extremely contentious in every single case. And there is, as far as I can tell, not one single one of these nation-state churches that gets out without having a schism first. I don't think. Someone can maybe correct me on that. But we get Bulgaria going first, saying we're going to have a nation, we're going to have a national church. There's schism with Constantinople for several decades. We get Serbia, we get Greece. And it always causes schism, and the older powers on the older models want to try to hold on. They want to say, no, we still have control over these territories under this old imperial structure. But they lose over and over, over and over and over. And the nation-state type claims end up winning for the Orthodox. And this process is still ongoing. There are still these claims out there. Ukraine is a huge one. If this is ringing any bells, it should be. This is absolutely essential to what's happening there. But there's also Macedonia, North Macedonia now, Montenegro, and a few other cases. The OCA is a wild inversion of everything, so I'm not even going to touch it, but it's really fascinating. It's the other side of a crazy coin. So we start to get national autocephaly, resulting in churches that are entirely independent, though hierarchical within themselves. The process is ongoing. The Orthodox have only been at this for about 100, maybe 150 years. It's very new, historically speaking, this phase 4 for the Orthodox. Catholics figured out what they wanted to do way earlier. So the Orthodox then now have to wrangle with what, if anything, holds them together. You've got these national churches starting to pop up. What connects those national churches, if anything at all? And what we've seen, I want to propose, is something I want to call the Neo-Ignatian model, with very strong emphasis on the neo. Okay? This is neo. It's a modern concept of the church. Fundamentally, in some ways, the Orthodox model of ecclesiology is the most thoroughgoing modernist ecclesiology out there. This is the modern, so we're the modernists. Really. And it's framed in a couple of different ways. One, like I said, these nation states. Another thing is conscious resistance to the papal model. Don't want to be doing what the Catholics are doing, uniting under the papacy. So I should say, as far as the Eastern Catholics go, as this receding is happening, they've solved the problem by uniting under Rome. It's a very elegant solution. It makes a lot of sense. It makes sense. So we'll manifest universality like that. So we become united.
We try.
Yeah. With the papacy. I would propose. So you feel free to disagree. Anything I say, by the way, really sincerely disagree with me. Left, right, and center if you think I've got it wrong. I'm truly trying this out for size. But yeah, so that's how I would sort of characterize Eastern Catholicism. But the Orthodox are very consciously not going to do that. We don't want a papacy by and large. Now there are some forces trying to sort of maybe centralize around Constantinople, maybe centralize around Moscow, to some degree, but there's, even among them, there's this, we're not like Rome, not like the Roman papacy, no, not like that. So that's one key consideration for the Orthodox. The second is that in very typical fashion, the Orthodox have wanted to look back into history to inform how to structure ourselves, to structure our churches today. And where they've gone is look to those pre-imperial centuries, that Ignatian model, and they've grabbed that and kind of brought it into this neo-Ignatian system that sees national churches as kind of the local church in a lot of respects, that are then united by goodwill, by brotherhood, by sharing of the truth, sharing of a specific theological vision across the world. And we get thinkers like, he's not particularly nationalist, but John Zizioulas, who really want to say the local church, that is the church. And the universal church is almost an emergent property of these local churches connecting one to the next. It's like an emergent property. And that, I would argue, has been, of late, the going vision of unity within the Orthodox Church. We have, on a bigger scale, very similar dynamics to those of the pre-imperial period, layered with a few leftover imperial claims. So you've still got these bishops in places like Istanbul making a pretty fundamentally imperial claim to certain kinds of power. Now, the neo-Ignatian solution I would propose has been surprisingly, I might almost say shockingly successful so far, until very recently maybe, for the Orthodox. Shockingly successful. Despite all the wrangling, despite how schisms are created every time one of these national churches comes along, they have been over and over again fixed, healed. We've worked it out. The Church of Greece is back in communion with the Church of Constantinople. Stuff over Estonia worked out. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. So remember that the Ignatian model, as I characterize it, really relies on goodwill. It leans on goodwill to make this universal thing work. And that, I think, is one of the key reasons why the Orthodox have been really amazingly successful in recent period, holding together as a single thing. In addition, the neo-Ignatian model, as I said, is very deeply modern. So it's sort of in many ways more naturally grafted on the map, on the globe as we understand it. Nation states correspond to the church in a way that other ecclesiological models don't. And that has serious advantages, it really does. It allows, when it's working well, a tremendous amount of local autonomy and a tremendous amount of diversity in practices. Much more than the Orthodox are often given credit for. Look at the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia has a Western right? No one's excommunicating for them than for that, even the ones who say they shouldn't. It's just kind of, it's their business, right? They have their local autonomy. They can practice more or less the way they want. But most importantly, I think we have been living in the golden age of Christian unity, as I proposed to you early on. And that plays really well with the Ignatian model. When goodwill prevails, these local communities can coalesce and work together. Never has goodwill been so great an ebb among Christians than today. And for that reason, the neo-Ignatian solution has kind of burst out of the Orthodox world in a lot of ways. There's a huge amount of influence on Roman Catholicism, especially after the Second Vatican Council. A lot of interest in conciliarity. We have things like the World Council of Churches. People get sitting down and saying, why don't we talk to each other? Free, independent Christians. Why don't we just speak to each other as equals? And a lot of that comes from, really does radiate out of the Orthodox world in many respects. Through this neo-Ignatian solution. So what happens if goodwill falls apart? What happens? Well, look around and see what happens. The problems of the neo-Ignatian model are just as easy to see as all of its advantages. Nothing holds Moscow and Constantinople together structurally. There's no one to make them sit down and work it out. There's no one to put them in the same room. There's no one to pick a winner. They will fight for as long as they want to fight until goodwill prevails again between them. No one can force all these Orthodox churches to show up at a council in Crete. You can try to persuade. You can spend decades planning, but there's no one to make you be there. And the churches that don't want to go, they won't go. There's nothing anyone can do about it. So if prevailing winds push bishops apart in this neo-Ignatian model, just like back in the original Ignatian model, if goodwill doesn't prevail, what can draw them back together? Prayer, the Holy Spirit, I would say. It's a huge problem. Now, I would propose this. The golden age of Christian unity is definitely not over just yet. I think there's some life left in this neo-Ignatian thing. And I think it's something we should still keep an eye on. Not just as Orthodox, but as Christians around the world. Perhaps this golden age really is coming to an end. Maybe it's all falling apart. The Orthodox are going to split up forever. Russia and Constantinople are done for good. Maybe. I don't know. I can't predict the future. I don't think so. I think there's still a lot of goodwill out there today. Christians feel a lot of pressure from the outside world. We feel more and more like a minority. We're being pushed together more and more and more. So I think there's a lot of life in this model. So what can we expect from the Orthodox Church then, if I'm right? If this goodwill isn't completely dead yet? I have 4 points I think we can expect. One, I think we can expect more complex and more porous relationships with non-Orthodox churches and groups. So remember, the fact that there's no one clearly in charge, no one can make these two guys sit back down together again, that same fact also allows all kinds of interesting, unusual, unexpected things to happen between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox. So one example that jumps to mind is the two Antiochs, the Eastern and the Oriental Orthodox patriarchs of Antioch, are in partial communion with each other. And even the other bishops who are screaming, well, that the Oriental Orthodox are heretics, they still haven't excommunicated the Eastern Orthodox patriarch of Antioch. It's a strange little moment of porousness. And on the DL, Oriental Orthodox in North America receive communion from Orthodox priests all the time. From Eastern Orthodox priests all the time, and vice versa. This is porousness. Catholic Orthodox relations, especially through the Eastern Catholics, very close. Similar kinds of porousness, similar kinds of connection. And because there is no overarching authority on top of all of the Orthodox, it actually loosens up those boundaries in a lot of interesting ways. So I expect that to continue. I expect it to get more complex. And for a lot of local, particular Orthodox communities to have better and better relations and even some intercommunion with non-Orthodox. I think that will continue to happen. The flip side of that coin is I think we can expect a lot of backlash from more conservative forces in the Orthodox Church. Very upset about that, sometimes for good reasons. Who are going to shout from the rooftops what a problem this is. And they're going to have to shout really loud because there's nobody again to stop it. So people who want to do it are going to push in that direction. People who don't are going to be kicking and screaming all the way. It's kind of the status quo, but I think it will continue. Number 3, I think we can expect more complex relationships within the Orthodox world, with frequent and sometimes extended periods of communion breakdown. This has been the status quo since the start of this neo-Ignatian model. Like I said, churches of Serbia, Greece, and others that are still ongoing. I think we can expect that to keep happening. No one can enforce unity from above. It has to kind of bubble up out of goodwill from below. So we're going to see these breakdowns, and we have one with these two guys right now. And they might be long, they might last a long time. But number 4, the flip side of that coin. We have to be prepared for the potential impermanence of these breakdowns. These lines in this neo-Ignatian schism have gotten very, very wobbly within the Orthodox Church and between the Orthodox and all the others. Very flexible. Things are going to move around a lot. So we've got to be just as ready for Moscow and Constantinople to wake up tomorrow, goodwill having returned, and work it out. And surprisingly, we've seen examples of that, like the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, like I said, or the Ethiopian Orthodox schism. When these bishops in this neo-Ignatian model, when they start to feel okay about each other, or a new bishop comes in, those schisms can heal just as quickly as they can happen. There's going to be a lot of that bouncing back and forth, I think. So all told, I think in this golden age of Christian unity, our era, we can expect a very fluid Orthodox Church within itself, in relation to other churches. And we can expect this model, I think, to survive for quite some time and continue to be both profoundly attractive to and very troubling for other Christians and for Orthodox ourselves. But I hope that this evening, by tracing out some of these roots and maybe giving a little more historical structure to where this is all coming from, at least in my view, we'll have a little bit of a better read, maybe a little bit more patient as things unfold, and maybe make a little more sense of what can sometimes seem like complete chaos in the Orthodox world and in the world of Eastern Christian ecclesiology. So thank you very much for your attention.
Certainly one of the most passionate, enthralling lectures that we've had this semester, and I understand why Father Jeffrey has put his A team together very carefully. So I feel like I would love to talk to Dan all evening, but I want to maybe pass it over to whoever would like to pose a question or comment. And as he said, bring it on.
Bring it on.
He's ready to take anything.
I truly mean that.
Hit him with your hardest shots.
Can you speak a little bit to something you didn't mention, but obviously it kind of layers over top of particularly the chart and so forth, which is the kind of the development of the sense of confessional Christianity. In other words, I belong to a group formed around a particular theology or whatever, as opposed to, and I'm speaking particularly about the apostolic churches, as opposed to I belong to the church of this place. Because in the early church, Christianity spreads, and the churches are all, in one place. People gather for the Eucharist and so forth, and out of that obviously comes that ecclesiological model that Zuzoulis talks about. But at a certain point, someone, say in Thessalonica, no longer thinks I'm just a Thessalonican Christian. I'm an Orthodox Christian belonging to this denomination which has a confessional kind of basis, as opposed to just simply the church gathered here. And my sense is about 18th century is kind of where that kicks in, where you get Greeks telling each other they have to rebaptize Catholics and so forth. Because up until then, for example, at the reunion councils, they are bishops of their areas gathering together. There's no sense in which these are two denominations negotiating. Right? They are the bishops of these areas, and the bishop. We may not agree with them, we may be out of communion with them, but they legitimately are the Christians from where they're coming from. But by the 18th century, we have the Catholic Church, we have the Orthodox Church, and they are different denominations, and therefore, we'll be setting up rival churches in different places and so forth. I don't know if that's the right.
18th century, I would say
is late.
Quite late. So struck through all of what I've said is the problem of theology. For sure. And that goes quite early. If you look between the Oriental and the Eastern Orthodox, you'll often have geographically overlapping. You've got two claimants in Antioch, you've got two claimants in Alexandria, right from the 5th century. And then in the 13th century, this is why I kind of tend to peg the Orthodox-Catholic divide really in the 13th century. This is when the Catholic Church will start appointing their own
Latin patriarch
and elsewhere. And so that's that kind of declaration that, no, you're not legitimate anymore. And that's when you can really say, I think, to my historiography, we really have two things going, two groups now here. So I think 18th century is quite late. But the interplay of the theology with these structures, it is very, very complicated. So I didn't make any attempt to account for that here. Because, theology can draw people outside of certain particular communities. Theology can absolutely cause schisms and divides. Theology can also create unity across huge swaths of space. There are Roman Catholics all around the world today. There are Orthodox all around the world, Protestant groups, etc., who are precisely united because they don't just see particularity and universality in terms of space and geography. Theology makes everything very complicated, very, very wrinkly. And it would take a whole different hour, I think, or a lot of research to kind of account for how that plays with it.
And yet, to this day, we don't have an Orthodox Bishop of Rome.
Well, I was just going to say, too, it's very interesting. And it's
we don't either.
You said
interesting comment, but yes. It is really an interesting piece of kind of historical rhetoric, you might almost say, but there's presumably, if you're an Eastern Orthodox, the Pope is still the legitimate Bishop of Rome, apparently.
We keep hoping.
But he's whatever. He's a problem for various reasons. A lot of people would answer that question in very different ways. But it's an interesting tidbit to notice that there's never been that done that way. Yeah.
Well, my major question is for Professor Opperwall, but just a word to Father Jeffrey first. Surely, I think you're absolutely right about confessionalism actually being that where walls and lines are set up. But your 18th century date, I think, is awfully late. If you go to any collection of creeds of the various churches, Schaff or any of them, or 90% of them from the 16th century. And that was the energy, the church, the ecclesial energy of the 16th century was discovering that your faith had these nuances of difference from that faith, and so you had to define it in a creed, and adherence to the church was measured by adherence to the creed, and that's also true of the Orthodox. It goes right back to the 4th century, where a whole group stuck with Ephesus, didn't go with Chalcedon, and so on and so on. So that's been going on like forever, and ever and ever.
But you get weird things like, when Ambrose is made the bishop in Milan, you got Arians and Orthodox in the same church, hoping that the next bishop is from their party, and Ambrose is specifically chosen because he was seen as being more neutral. So there was clearly a sense in which we are the Christians of Milan. We may not agree with each other, but we're in one place, and we have to kind of stick it out.
Sometimes, the Pelagian schism is even weirder, where you end up with 2 Orthodox bishops because one of them used to not be, and then he does switch, but they're still in schism and they can't figure it out, and it actually continues to another generation of bishops because they can't figure it out. But this is sort of my point with that chart, is that these things have always been very complicated and wobbly, and it's never been like, everyone is united, whether by creed, whether by geography. There's never been this time when this was all simple. There were always these crazy complex things.
Yeah. Nevertheless, I do think Father Jeffrey's point is fundamental, and one can't leave out the dynamic of theology and all of this.
I agree.
In the Canadian Council of Churches, where there is an enormous amount of interspecies harmony and goodwill and all the nice things you were talking about, the one time the Faith and Witness Commission ever fell flat on its face was when it tried to find consensus around doctrine.
It's
nothing. Now, for you, I have both a comment and a question. And the comment is just a report. Father Jeffrey and I just came from the Orthodox Theological Scholars of America, and the very first paper was about unity or disunity in the earliest church, and it was a very interesting paper. But the basic thesis was that if you look for any concrete expression of the church, you have to deal with the local church. But nevertheless, everybody seems to have this sense of unity. And so where does it rest? And the conclusion, rather vague actually, was that it rests in faith in the gospel. That was the common thread. You're Christian if you've got faith in the gospel. We would today say the kerygma. So what they're doing is, it's exactly what you said. What they're doing is working out the gospel, but there's all these local versions of it. According to Raymond Brown, there are even 4 different Johannine churches.
It gets very complicated.
And so on. Back to the point about doctrine, by the way, in the 16th century, the Orthodox get very caught up in that 16th century energy, and one of our most notorious episodes was Cyril Lucaris, who opted into a Calvinist version of what the Orthodox creed should look like, and the whole church had to kind of rise up and sell him to the emperor to kill him. And it led them to actually define a creed at the Council of Yash.
Can we circle back, because I'm seeing a bunch of hands keep popping up, so can we circle back to you, Richard?
Thank you, a marvelous lecture. Something that, and so this is part comment, part question. I'm constantly struck by the way in which these discussions about unity go off in different directions depending on what is being sought
Yeah, absolutely.
through unity.
Yeah.
And it seems clear to me that unless the desire for unity is precisely a desire to further the mission of the church, and in fact the gospel, unity per se can mean nothing, you know. It can be just, as one would say in Slavic, a conjunctura, you know, kind of arrangement, you know, to get other things done. And so I'm interested in hearing your comment on the fact that the strength of Roman Catholicism, and I mean Roman Catholicism as opposed to Roman Catholicism with the Eastern Catholics, because the Eastern Catholics have imbibed, you know, some of the darker sides of Orthodox autocephalism. But on the Roman Catholic side, there is this sense that the mission is so important that we will basically kind of, you know, cede, you know, jurisdictional oversight to this guy over in Rome. And that positive dimension has ended up also being the downfall of Roman Catholicism, because what we see now, I mean, the reason that things are falling apart at the seams is that because for too long there was this idea, okay, we'll let the magisterium basically over in Rome kind of decide about different things, and we'll just kind of, you know, we'll go along, we'll recognize, we'll love each other, etc. And the folks over there will make the decisions, and then at the local level, you get very, very conflicting ideas of what, you know, the mission of the church is actually all about. So I mean, in essence, I'm kind of granting or insisting on kind of, you know, real credence to your fundamental thesis, which is that things are becoming very porous as a result of the developments that I mentioned. But I think that if there's anything, I mean, there are all sorts of things that I could criticize with regard, and in fact I have criticized them with regards to you know, Catholicism, even Eastern Catholicism. I think that if there's anything that has become a very you know, a very difficult and tragic underbelly of the Orthodox reality, is that even when you're able to have these unities between different centers, the unity still doesn't seem to have that same missional purposeness, because the moment that one has to leave those jurisdictional centers, which will recognize each other, okay, oh fine, you guys are up there, okay, yeah, fine, we'll cede jurisdiction to you up there for your people in that area, and you recognize we have jurisdiction here. But the moment that you actually have to go into new territories, you know, and I think this is why, you know, I mean, let's face it, Crete, the big issue was how are we going to grant autocephaly? So they decided not to discuss it, and one of the reasons being that, you know, in the New World, you know, here in North America, and in fact, that is my question to you. I'd love to hear what you mentioned the OCA in passing as a kind of the other side of the coin, because I think it brings to the fore some of the frustration that, you know, we on the Catholic side see with regards to Orthodox, which, by the way, is matched by frustration on the Orthodox side with regard to Eastern Catholicism, but it's basically the short answer to the question that's frequently posed to Eastern Catholics: why don't you just become Orthodox? And basically, kind of, you know,
you're looking at it. Yeah, I think the Orthodox will say very similar things for both good reasons and bad reasons about papal unity. I mean, it sometimes comes off as a kind of petulance, almost a childishness. Well, we're just we're going to be different. We don't want to be Rome. But there are also really serious problems with papal unity. And you can look at the sexual abuse scandals and look at all kinds of other things that show you our virtues. I'm always fond of saying our virtues are always the same thing as our vices. That's true for us as individuals. It's true for us as communities. And so these communities, I see them as looking at each other and being both really quite right. Look at the mess you are. And they're both right when they say that. And so on we go. And then they can both look at each other and also say, look at the virtue, look at the value of your viewpoint, which is kind of more what I was trying to emphasize in this.
But I don't give it. So the golden age of unity. Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. It may be over there.
We're living in this room.
Yeah, precisely. But in the New World, in North America, where is the golden age of Orthodox unity? This is the question.
I think the North American example is, it does encapsulate in so many ways almost everything that's going on with the Orthodox Church. Because on the one hand, it is a nightmarish mess, and on the other hand, it's just not that bad. And it's weird how not that bad.
No, but you see, but this is the difference, okay? And I'm speaking from experience, constantly hang out with Roman Catholics. For Roman Catholics, this kind of discussion seems just so bizarre. It seems like ecclesial navel gazing, because we're constantly talking about who's in, who's out, etc. And the fact is, by the way, that in one sense North America is not a kind of microcosm of what's going on elsewhere, because if you're just sitting in Greece, or if you're sitting in some town even in Russia, or something, you're not considered as, we're okay, we are here with a local church, fine. It's when you're sitting in Chicago, or New York, or I'm going to a panachida tonight where half of the people will want me to be able to come celebrate because I knew this Ukrainian Orthodox guy really well. The other half will say, well, we love you, but you can't, etc. Yeah. Well, that kind of, as I say, for the average Roman Catholic, that kind of discussion, of course, there are all sorts of things that we can critique about, the Roman Catholic side. But what I'm simply getting at is this the frustration in the New World, 250 years old, of having to constantly discuss this, and the only reason it's frustrating is because it prevents everyone from getting on with the mission. The average Roman Catholic, no matter how bizarre, no matter how heretical they might be, whatever, the average Roman Catholic says, oh yeah, we exist here to build hospitals, have schools, do chaplaincies, etc. And that's the thrust. Yeah. And it basically, there comes a point where you say to yourself, in the end, Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them. Which is I've never heard anyone actually do an ecclesiological reflection on that one, because at the end of the day, it's one of the few statements that actually have that kind of really solid divine approbation. But anyway, I didn't mean to give another lecture.
I think it's a legitimate and interesting criticism. I keep seeing hands go too.
And just really quickly, I wanted to ask, earlier in the lecture you had mentioned that a lot of what's going on in society in the world today is driving Christians to get closer together.
I think so.
Whether they're Eastern Orthodox, whether they're Oriental Orthodox, Roman Catholic, what kind of how big a role do you see something like that? Bringing this golden age of Christian unity to pass. Is that even part of the Holy Spirit's agenda to see that? What's your opinion on how you see what are the greater world itself and society driving us together, so we forget all these smaller things? Right.
Yeah. No, I think you put your finger on it. I don't know the Holy Spirit's agenda. He's not yet revealed.
Of course not.
To me, I will let you know if he lets me know. But I would love to. But I think absolutely. I think pressure is a huge, is the single biggest driving factor. Christians, although Christianity is still by far the biggest religion in the world, but there's a different feel for a lot of people in a lot of places. In the places where Christianity is still growing quickly, maybe it's almost a growth that maybe sometimes draws people together, but sometimes creates. I'm thinking of places like Africa and some, especially the African continent. The second thing that I think does make a difference, but not nearly as important probably, is communication. It's got its positives and it's got its negatives. We can bicker more easily, we can fight more easily, but we also, when communication gets rid of mythologies and false impressions, then it often brings people together. So work like the World Council of Churches, and I think people sitting down talking is more possible now than it used to be. So that's good and bad, but I think it's part of it. But the biggest thing is that increasing sense. I think that we're almost like a minority in this world. Yeah.
I think we have to underline two things. When I studied ecclesiology at the Vatican University, I had a very good professor from Yugoslavia, and he kept always underlining that the church means the word koinonia, the Greek means community. And look how that could be realized. Father Peter Galazzo is here today as a priest.
Yeah.
He has a brother, Father Roman. When his church burnt down in Brampton, I pick up the Toronto Star, and so the reporter says, so what are you going to do? He says, we're not worried. It was a building. The church is the people. We will rebuild. He built another church. Number two, we have to focus on the role of the laity as well.
Yeah.
One of my former professors who became the patriarch of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Ruba Merhuza, in the aspiration for our church to obtain our patriarch, he kept saying, but the wanting has to be from the people as well.
Yeah.
And the people in our church, he said in a later article, are 99%. So I don't want to use the word demand, but we people should be aspiring to that as well. But we also should know our role as the church is the people.
Yeah.
So do something.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. I mean, I focus a lot on bishops and hierarchy in this talk, but yeah, I mean, the laity is just so hugely important. It doesn't take itself nearly seriously enough. I couldn't possibly agree with you more. Yeah.
Okay, I have two things to say. Spiritually, I have immense, unspeakable respect for Jesus. Because the church in Latin is Christus taught us. Because in the end, there's only one church, but Jesus holds all everything together. A lot of suffering. Because when we fight each other, it hurts the heart of Jesus very much.
Yeah.
So we have to be unceasingly giving praise and thanks to Jesus. He holds everything together. Okay, the second thing is, with all the respect to the gay and lesbian movement, this movement has destroyed unity.
Well, sorry, what?
The gay and lesbian movement. With all due respect, I made a hidden division between the many Roman Catholic bishops. Some giving Holy Communion to those gay. It has a big problem. The Anglican Church, they ordain lesbian bishops. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's again probably a whole second paper to try to be similar to Father Jeffrey's question, like how does theology cut into all this? How does ethics? And that's very much a huge issue in the modern world that absolutely is profoundly divisive from everybody's point of view. And that question of how should we live ethically, how should we live morally as Christians, it strikes right through this. I don't want to seem naive, but I claim this is the golden age of Christian unity. I'm trying to be a little bit provocative, frankly. I'm trying to be optimistically provocative. But these are enormous problems, and they're just struck through all of this. And it's complicated to trace how that plays with these communities.
Yeah. And my comment follows on that is, do you see? It sounds like you would take the Nicene Creed, the notes of the Church, as being prescriptive rather than descriptive. That just as we strive towards holiness, we strive towards unity. Is it sounding we're returning to an eschatological model in force of this being oppression of some kind? So we're united in our persecution at some level, and that makes us then think about an eschatological horizon. But I'm wondering then, where does sacramental practice fall into this? Doug? Have you come as a result of this reflection to think, to put it simply, that the Eucharist is the means to unity, or is it the consummation? Because if it can be so almost frivolously given and withdrawn as a function of various as a function of political intrigues, in a sense, doesn't not that very withholding of it in itself? People often say, well, it's giving it too easily that cheapens it. But sometimes it seems, in this light of what you said, that the very withholding of it, or the weaponizing of it, we're breaking communion with Constantine Moscow.
Yeah,
it's like, well, if you expect us to think that you're always telling us the reason you can't give us the Eucharist is because we don't share the same faith as you, and now we don't have the same liturgy. And now with people who share the same faith as you and the same liturgy as you, and you won't give them either communion. I mean, who is ever holy enough? In other words, you have to have tick all the boxes, same faith, same liturgy, same history, same everything, and plus we all have to be able, we have in this present moment have to be getting along and agree on jurisdiction, and then we can have communion.
Yeah.
It almost makes the person who favors the intercommunal as it were, justifies their cynicism and says, and so that's why we're at least trying that model, because let's see if by intercommunion at some level coming back to Sacris, we don't actually in fact grow closer.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm certain that happens. I just know what would be your if you were a priest, let's say, what would be your pastoral approach, and we'll say what happens.
This is the number one reason that I'm not a priest. Because I don't want to have to make those decisions. No, I'm only half kidding. It's incredibly complicated. I don't, just speaking for myself only, I think I see it as a both and. I absolutely agree that the weaponizing is a really good way of putting it. Calling it a weaponizing it's tremendously problematic. And I think it's tremendously problematic from an Orthodox, even a very conservative Orthodox point of view. You'd have to say, this is not the kind of stuff that we're supposed to be going into schism over. Some argument about 17th century canonical territory. I think it's hugely problematic. On the other hand, I do think the other thing you said, which is that just kind of eliminating all discipline, which would be the other extreme, and just saying, well, anyone who feels prepared or whatever to come in is problematic too, because then I worry in that situation about things getting actually just atomized completely, where everyone's just doing whatever they want, and so there isn't any kind of cohesion. There's some balance there, I think, when it comes to Eucharist. That's really, really hard. I don't know that any Christian group has ever struck that balance with perfection. Weaponization goes way back to the ancient world. So does a very sincere approach to both theological and moral and other forms of discipline as expectations, a very sincere pastoral desire that it not be given unto condemnation, that sort of thing. Both of these streams are there forever. They're still here today. They manifest in particular ways in the Orthodox Church. They manifest in different ways in the Roman Catholic Church or the Anglican Church. Again, unfortunately, there always are vices. I think you're right on both counts. Weaponizing is a tragedy, and just being completely willy-nilly, I think, is a problem.
Can I just finish with a compliment to the OCA, just so that people understand where I was coming from? I hope that your next lecture will be entitled, again, The Golden Age of Christian Unity, Eastern Orthodox Ecclesiology, and you will then share with us the experience of the OCA, because I think that the ability to bring together these different ethnic groups, and then also the ability of the OCA to be as mission-oriented as it is. I think the fact, and this is not, it's not that it's not a compliment to you because you're willing to be here, work with us, but in essence, you folks and we folks, basically we're here regularly because we really believe that there's something much bigger than these jurisdictional issues. Oh, they're okay.
Who are also very missional. Who are also very missional.
Well, and that's right. The Antiochians are also very missional, precisely. Yeah. And so I think that in essence that's a compliment to you about the next lecture that you'd be OCA and Antiochian.
Actually, if you could compare and contrast the mission and ecclesiology in the OCA and the Antiochian Church, I think that would be really edifying, because in the one you're moving from the autocephalous model, and it's then less resulting in a missional model, and the other you're saying it's an attempt to gather this multiplicity into unity, and it also ends up by the fruits. If we're talking by the fruits, well then the fruits are in my experience, quite comparable with the OCA.
Yeah, it's not just the OCA and Antioch. It's the whole North American situation is. like I said, and I don't even have necessarily time, but it becomes a mirror, and I think of everything I've discussed here. It's not a microcosm wasn't the right word. I think I did use that word, but that wasn't the right word. It's the mirror. It seems like everything is flipped, but there's the same kinds of dynamics happening there that are affected by the neo-nation.
Can we ask, are you teaching any courses next semester that we can advertise to the students who are?
I'll be teaching our New Testament course along with Father Jeffrey, and
with a strong eschatological focus, no doubt.
He's my
Absolutely.
eschatology.
We're going to try to
guy, so-
figure out how Paul got roped into this Jerusalem thing.
And I guess modern church history might be under some. It might be either me or Professor Schneider. I'm not completely sure, or maybe some combination. But yeah, it's coming up. Do we have some time to come back to your question, Richard?
Yeah. It's quick, although the answer will not be quick. Although, when people have to remember their history, ipso facto, this is the golden age of unity in Christianity. Why? Because it's the first age in all of history since the year 1 that there has not been a Christian war of religion. The first.
I was thinking that when you were talking about it.
Absolutely.
I mean, people were fighting over Calvinism, Arminianism. I mean, today they're on faculties together and writing books
Infinitely
together.
bloody, much worse than the
Yes,
war against ISIS.
absolutely.
Okay, so therefore the question on the table isn't is this the golden age? The question on the table is what made it possible.
Yeah.
And what made the ecumenical movement possible, which is another example. The lack of a war of religion. The only warring religion of the ecumenical movement is the Orthodox.
Yeah.
Who keep walking out and making trouble.
After helping to found it, though, which is very
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
No, the Orthodox in 1902 started it.
started it, and now
In 1920 called the Council into being, and
which is exactly what I'm talking about here.
and one of the big guiding spirits in 1948 was George Florovsky.
Yeah.
Could it be that what makes it possible is that we've had a real shift around the idea of truth, which is what underlies the idea of doctrine, and we're willing to talk more. One has to pick a word carefully here. I don't think we have a good word for it yet, but I'll say pluralistic. But truth being a spectrum, right? And therefore, one can have conversation around the truth because people are picking up their corner of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And what the ecumenical dialogue is sharing it with other people. And in this sense, I guess we do it better, in the ecumenical movement than we do it inside Orthodoxy, because we're not used to that yet. Luke Timothy Johnson characterizes the Orthodox as being the right wing of the truth spectrum, in the sense that they simply refuse to admit that the Enlightenment ever happened. But maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
And we can have meetings like this in Orthodox seminaries and so on, where there can be points of view.
Yeah.
And that manifests itself structurally because, again, from Otzuk, and I've heard, one knows this from everybody, we have the Assembly of North American Bishops. And they're really, really trying. They're not a mock group like the Council in Crete was. They're really trying to find, the ways to embrace the spectrum.
Yeah.
So, could it be that that's what makes what you're talking about possible? Modern philosophy.
Absolutely, yes.
Modern hermeneutic.
That's my
Disestablishment is
Absolutely.
actually more important. The fact that the churches aren't civic organizations in the way that
It's a
they're.
big
That's
argument.
real, because it's the politics that always gets in the way.
That's absolutely true, and that's been true ever since there's been in America. The genius of Christianity in North America is that it's totally disestablished, and we got the First Amendment. And therefore, every church has to stand on its own feet and proclaim its own understanding of the gospel. And if you work in the ecumenical movement, as Father Jeffrey and I do, right away you realize that your co-educators are Christians, guaranteed. We may differ on doctrine, like 20 continents, but we will all agree that Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world. And that's what Father Peter's talking about. That's the mission.
Dr. Sheptytsky.
Before Brian thanks Dan, very appropriate, it's a very important announcement. Many of you may not have never heard of the name Robert Dodaro, but he's giving a lecture here in a couple of weeks on Augustine in the East, which you need to understand, I mean, because sometimes people don't have a chance to read all the bio. For 12 years, he was the president of the Pontifical Patristic Institute, the Augustinianum. He rotated out of that. He's now living just north of Toronto, and he's a very prominent Augustine scholar. But the reason I'm bringing your attention to this is because he frequently, for years, he would travel to Greece to engage Greek Orthodox theologians in discussions regarding Augustine. Okay, so in view of both his stature and his connections with the Orthodox East, I think it's something that you want to keep on your radar screen.
Yeah,
Well, and
absolutely.
before that, we have Dr. Jesse Billett from Trinity next week, looking at Oriental Orthodoxy. An Anglican liturgist looks at Oriental Orthodoxy and Eastern Orthodoxy, the mirror of schism, question mark. So some great talks still coming up for the remainder of the semester. Dan, this is really stunning, and I'm only sorry that we didn't get you here earlier last year. Please, it was nothing, no intentional omission. I'm just so grateful, and I hope we're able to build on this collaboration with the future.
I agree. Yes.
Please give a warm welcome.